think, Marge. All I need is a title.
Well, first a couple of things. I have to apologize for the audio quality of my voice. First off, I have a sore throat. Secondly, I'm recording this audio through my iPhone because I'm not at home. I'm currently in the hospital. I don't have access to my microphone system at home. So, here's what you get. Anyway, let me first put down a couple of ground rules about this video before we evaluate the question. First, I have to tell you that I am a practicing atheist, which means that I don't believe in a God. While I also have degrees in both history and psychology, neither of these create a possible bias that might color my research or commentary. In fact, I will use the education I have achieved to provide me with as much of an unbiased view as I can. Of course, I welcome commentary on my work. Secondly, I have expanded the question a bit from when it was first proposed by Godless Cranium, who asked the basic question, what if Jesus Christ didn't exist? I decided to expand it to include the concept of a Son of God, and this is to prevent the argument that the exact same series of events would have occurred, but the name of the Messiah would have been someone other than Jesus. This also removes this messianic notion from the history. So, the Jewish writers of the Bible and anyone writing in the New Testament would not have had much to write about. Other figures such as John the Baptist and the Essenes were left alone. Finally, our third rule will be stolen from our first video, and that is that anything that is not directly related to our change will be left alone to affect history how it wishes. In fact, this might cause some ripples to affect our new altered history. In order to address the question, we must first review the history of Judaism, because the roots of the Jesus story are here, whether we are talking about the story itself or the tale as written by the Jewish writers at the time. The religion started off with the ancient collection of stories, most likely passed around orally. Archaeological studies and Egyptology have both indicated that the early Hebrews originated in the area of northern Yemen and northwestern Arabia, and they later migrated northward into Palestine. Izzat Ashraf, in his book Egypt Knew No Pharaohs Nor Israelites, suggested that the Babylonians invaded, sacked, and subjugated the Hebrews in southwestern Arabia in response to Hebrew piracy along the trade routes in the area. It was during the Babylonian captivity that the earliest books of the Bible were transcribed by intellectuals. The post-captivity Jews moved back into Palestine, where some earlier groups of Jews had migrated into from their ancestral lands in Yemen. Through this time, the Jews developed both the worship of the volcano god Yahweh, and they also adopted portions of Zoroastrianism, melding parts of or all of this into a unified theology. Putting on the believer hat for a bit, the Jesus story is one of fall and redemption on both a personal and a societal level. The Hebrews fall and are restored on various levels at numerous times throughout the Old Testament. And the ministry of Jesus is founded on the idea that anyone, from an individual on up, can be redeemed from their own personal version of mankind's fall, to receive an eternal reward. Or as summarized in John 3:16, quote, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life." Whether or not one believes the Jesus story or not, its effect on history and its growth and influence worldwide is quite evident. Given the problems that various empires had with controlling the area in and around Palestine, especially the Maccabean revolt from 167 to 160 BC, by the time the Romans conquered the region, they were probably well aware of the Jews as troublemakers. They put control of Palestine in the hands of a series of client kings, starting with Herod the Great, who was renowned for both his architectural patronage as well as an incredibly cruel tyranny. As in our timeline, the Romans gave their king and the religious authorities some autonomy, provided that they kept things under control. In our revised timeline, the rulers did the same thing, targeting messianic prophets and religious agitators such as the Essenes. The authorities never found the Messiah. John the Baptist was captured and executed on the orders of King Herod, and Barabbas was crucified between two other robbers at Golgotha. Within the next 60 years, the Romans and religious authorities dealt with various Jewish activist elements, including the Essenes, who had moved into the areas around the Dead Sea and the fortress at Masada. During the Second Jewish Revolt, the Romans sacked Masada and destroyed the temple at Jerusalem. This forced the more outspoken Jewish factions underground. Religious opposition to the state was muted and practiced mostly in the home. Roman oppression of religion gradually relaxed, and the various state religions were sustained, which left no real vacuum to be filled. The status quo continued, while the quality of the Roman leadership and Roman military generally declined, and barbarian tribes were allowed to cross into the empire and settle along its outer edges, in areas such as present-day Romania, Italy, and France. From 376 to 476 CE, various barbarian invasions sapped the already weakened Roman Empire of whatever strength it had left, and by 476 CE, Flavius Odoacer overthrew the Roman Emperor Romulus and became the first ruler of Italy. The collapse of Rome plunged Western and Central Europe into the Dark Ages. There are people out there who see the church as the bastion of all evil in the world, an institution with ancient roots that has done very little good over the course of history, and they'll cite such things as the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the more recent pedophile scandal that has rocked the church since the 1990s, when such cases began to get more attention. And by the way, I'm not excusing any of that here. However, I believe that people miss the fact that at times the church has been a force of good, if only because of necessity. In our timeline, the church served a valuable function in the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire. Aside from the religious aspects of the church, it was involved in the preservation of books and other texts, as well as knowledge of ancient times. In some cases, it may have been that the church was the only thing holding some of the barbarian tribes back. Perhaps one of the most basic extensions of the church duty was the fact that many church buildings had a clock, and the priest would toll the bells at the top of each hour of the day, thus providing the surrounding people with some means of measuring the passage of the day. This might seem trivial to us today, but society in the Dark Ages had devolved to the point where nobody had the ability to keep track of time. They depended on the bells of the village church. In our alternate timeline, I won't say that things changed too much. The Dark Ages may have seemed a bit darker, as the local church was also the community center, and people looked to the church for something to take their minds off the dullness and drudgery of their lives. Perhaps the Renaissance was delayed by 10 or 20 years. Now, some of you might be saying that in the absence of Christianity, Judaism would have simply spread and become the dominant religion of Europe. Judaism might have spread somewhat, but it was not really an evangelistic religion. That role was taken up by Christianity. In fact, most of the books of the New Testament are letters of Paul to the various new churches of the Near East. So a lot of responsibility had to be taken up by what was left of the states, and given this, we can say that while the chaos was pretty extensive, law and order was kept pretty well within the borders of a state, whether it be a former Roman province, a city, a village, or a noble manor. One religion that did evangelize rather brutally was Islam, which was founded during the mid-600s, and quickly started taking over territory, forming a religious empire of sorts. On October 10, 732, forces from the Umayyad Caliphate that were invading southern France were stopped by the French under Charles Martel. Martel, of course, went on to found the dynasty that would lead to the Carolingians, which formed the distant basis for both France and Germany. Perhaps the biggest factor before the Renaissance was the conflict between Islam and the Church. Without the Church, a lot of this conflict would have been changed. On the one hand, there would be no authority behind such things as the Crusades, which would not have happened, but on the other hand, the Muslims would have still moved into parts of Europe, including the Balkans, the destruction of the Eastern Roman Empire in the mid-1200s, and into southern portions of Russia in the late 1200s and early 1300s. The West responded to this Muslim expansion by resorting to an aggressive posture against potential Islamic threats. In a sense, this was similar to the Crusades, but without the religious motivation. There was no Holy Land to save. Rather, they were defending their own nations from subjugation from the invaders. Nations such as Sweden, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and France saw the creation of kingdoms that would stand up against the Muslims. These kingdoms, such as they were, insulated most of Europe from attack. Russia, however, was a lost cause, as the Duchy of Moscow was attacked and conquered by the Muslims at this time. Rulers in Spain still take advantage of the weaknesses within the Muslim ruling classes of the Caliphate to rise up and liberate most of Spain. The Spanish, who had been fighting the Muslims since 792, completed the Reconquista exactly 700 years later and funded the voyages of Christopher Columbus from loot acquired in the final conquests. Castile and Aragon unite to form a united Spain, and the threat from the Muslims from that quarter is largely extinguished. In our new timeline, one cannot underestimate the importance that the destruction of the Black Plague had on the states of Europe. Russia, Italy, France, and Britain were all hit hard by the disease, which also spread into the Middle East through contact with Russia. The biggest thing this does is to weaken Russia and the Muslim states in the Middle East, and the biggest impact is that the Muslims are not able to put as many people into the invasions of Europe later. As another aside, King Henry VIII of England simply uses his authority as king to divorce any of his wives that do not produce a male heir. He then executes most of them because he's the king. Because of the extent of the Dark Ages, the Renaissance is delayed by roughly 200 years and does not begin to take place until the mid-1500s. However, one of the results of this is that religions such as Judaism begin to make a slow advance into Europe, setting up large temples in places like Rome, Paris, and London. Without the Church, Martin Luther would not have published his 95 Theses. There would not have been a Reformation, then no Counter-Reformation. The Holy Roman Empire would not have existed in that form. Instead, the Germanic states might have combined with some northern Italian states to form the Germanic League, which, along with the states of central and southern Italy, would have been at the center of diplomatic, political, and military machinations from France or Poland. The lack of a church would mean that the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest wars in European history, would not have happened. Instead, the time between 1618 and 1648 would have been focused on holding the threat of Islam at bay. The Muslims would have tried to advance into Central Europe, and they would have been stopped at Vienna, as in our timeline, with the help of France, Hungary, and Poland. However, the assault would leave Austria so weakened that it would remain a minor state. Muslim Europe would begin just southeast of the walls of the city, and the Austrian Empire would never exist. This would lead to the Kingdom of Prussia, later forming their version of Greater Germany, which would include most of present-day Austria. The 1700s saw the rise of Great Britain as a major power and the decline of France as the British gained some lands in Brittany and Normandy. The British had also gotten involved in the exploration race, with the first settlements in America having been established in 1620. The Muslims, however, score a major victory when they defeat Poland, Sweden, and Denmark in the Great Northern War, which allowed the Islamic State in Russia to remain viable. However, the seeds for the fall of this theocracy had been laid back in 1613 when Michael I became the client king in Russia and started using his power and influence to marginalize his Muslim overlords. By the beginning of the 1700s, Peter the Great is in power, and he uses the failure of Russian forces in the Great Northern War as his leverage to start pushing the Muslims out of control of the government. Later czars further pushed for more autonomy. By the time Napoleon entered Moscow on a quest to remove Russia from Muslim influence, most of that work had already been done. He was forced to retreat in humiliation, and Alexander I took the throne. The influence of the church in world affairs wanes through the 17 and 1800s. The Puritans who fled England in the 1600s did not do so. Instead, the colonization of the New World was primarily a business venture, funded by kings and governments, and undertaken by adventurers looking for New World gold, or the chance to strike it out on their own and forge their own destiny. There is little impact on the founding of the colonies that would later become the United States, because most of the leaders of the American Revolution were not heavily religious. The American Revolution is still the inspiration for the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon, who does everything that he did in our own timeline. The only difference was that he was cheered by leaders in England, Denmark, and Sweden, who saw him almost as the Muslim slayer, while Poland and Hungary were left to deal with him. In part, it was France's dismal performance in the Napoleonic Wars that resulted in the rise of Russia as a Western monarchy. With the weakening of both Poland and Hungary, Russia would later expand into the area and place both of these countries under their control. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Prussia worked to bring more and more of the smaller territories of the German League under their control. By 1870, they were ready to make their final move and instigated a war with France over the Germanic lands of the Upper Rhine Basin, including Alsace and Lorraine. This short-lived Franco-German war allowed Prussia to unite all of the lands of the Germanic League north of the Alps, including Austria, under their control into a united Germany. In part, due to the decline of the Islamic states, which led to the rise of both Russia and the Ottomans, Muslim control of the region of the Balkans fractures somewhat. The assassination of a Russian diplomat by a Hungarian national in Sarajevo sparks World War I, which Germany sees as an opportunity to further humiliate France. With the extra help of the Austrian nation, territory, and resources, Germany is able to overrun Paris and win the war. Alsace and Lorraine are permanently ceded to Germany, and Algeria, French West Africa, and Indochina become German colonies. In order to keep the Russians out of the war, the Germans allow Vladimir Lenin to leave a German jail and travel home. There is little resistance along the eastern frontier, and the Russian Revolution in 1917 finished the job. Germany took Poland and Hungary as client states, and to add insult to injury, they also joined the conflict against the communists along with the British and the Americans. With a German victory in World War I, there was no motivation for the far right in Germany to seize power, as the people were quite happy with their government, a marginally constitutional monarchy which sometimes listened to the parliament. The first German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, set the precedent by flouting parliament when he wanted, and then presenting proof of German success when called on the carpet for it. Subsequently, Hitler never rose to power, although he did serve on the French front during the war. World War II is thus limited to a Pacific War between Russia, China, Japan, and the United States. The U.S. becomes concerned when the Japanese pull off the rape of Nanking and announce an embargo. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 is a response to being penned in. Perhaps the biggest issue in this timeline is the pace of technology. With the Enlightenment and the Renaissance being delayed, in this timeline, there is no real use of aircraft during World War I, because air power was still rudimentary. By the 1940s, militaries around the world had started using biplanes. The development of the computer was not to happen until the 1980s. In short, the elimination of the whole Son of God concept, and through that the removal of Christianity from history, results in none of the destructive things that the Church has been involved with in our own timeline. No crusades, no Inquisition, and no religious wars in Europe, as we've explained. However, as we also explained, the Church was the main driver of retention of knowledge, when it was necessary to preserve that knowledge. For better or worse, short of the Crusades, the Church also organized Europe to be able to fight the threat of the Muslim invaders who failed to break through at Vienna, and in our timeline, this led to the consolidation and rise of the Austrian state. While the author posing this question might have been looking for a history with a bit more of a sunny outlook, it simply doesn't work that way. The absence of Christianity means that Islam would have been more prevalent, and if it weren't for the Black Plague, Muslims might still to this day control Russia and large parts of Europe in this alternate timeline. It was only through the vagaries of almost dumb luck and the ability of the states to come together around themselves as states that allowed them to defend Europe against the spread of Islam, and by the time this system starts to fray and the European states really start to fight amongst themselves, the Islamic states have also been weakened to the point where they cannot take advantage of the situation. The 1960s, 70s, and 80s were decades of relative peace, except in the Middle East, where various wars broke out between Jews living in Israel, which had been formed in 1948 over the objections of the Saudi Arabian king and their neighbors. Gamal Abdel Nasser attempted to invade Israel, but the Israelis, along with substantial Western help, obliterated the Egyptian armed forces, humiliated all of the invaders, and occupied the Suez Canal. The Arabs responded by initiating an oil embargo which lasted from 1967 until 1969. A further shock happened in 1990 and 91 when Muslim governments in Europe were brought down. This was done by citizens who saw the decline of the Muslims in wars against Israel and because of reports of mismanagement of government. This was followed in 1991 by the Persian Gulf War, as Saddam Hussein used the pretext of a territorial dispute to invade Kuwait. This fractured the Islamic States even more, in part because one nominally Muslim nation was attacking another Muslim nation, and also because Saudi Arabia, who had led the opposition against the West only 20 years earlier, now needed their help to prevent a takeover of their country. This led to 500,000 U.S. and allied troops being based out of Saudi Arabia, and these troops were used to counterattack and destroy Iraq. Because of a number of what some radicals considered to be slights against Islam, Wahhabi clerics approached the Saudi king to complain about foreign soldiers on Muslim soil. The king responded in the same manner as earlier monarchs, that using a tool does not mean that the tool is against Islam, even if that tool is a foreign army. This, of course, did not satisfy the radicals, but most of them accepted it because it was tradition to accept most of the rulings of the king. One of those who did not accept this decision was Osama bin Laden, a member of the bin Laden family, and the family's substantial business holdings. Osama used his portion of the family wealth to train terrorists and hire specialists. It was some of these people who attacked the United States on September 11, 2001, destroying World Trade Center Towers 1, 2, and 4, and badly damaging the Pentagon. A fourth plane, headed for the Capitol, was stopped by the heroic actions of the passengers on that plane. An enraged nation had no problem calling for a crusade against those responsible for the attacks. Many nations cooperated out of simple fear that they might fall into the wrath of a vengeful United States. Libya ended its own involvement in terrorism as the United States went into Afghanistan looking for the Taliban and Osama bin Laden. Most of the rest of history from this point forward plays out almost as it did in our own timeline. Removing the Christian religion from history does not change human nature. It also does not completely remove the influence of the Abrahamic religions. It simply means that another of the two remaining are more influential. In this case, Islamic states in southeastern Europe survive into the 20th century. It also illustrates one thing that we saw in our first alternate history video, that the further away you get from the initial event, the smaller the ripples throughout history get, to the point that 2,000 years later, we have virtually the same world. Again, thanks to Godless Cranium for the suggestion of this question. We will be providing a link to his channel in the description below. Feel free to check it out. He does put together some really good content.